Number. The old cat refused to leave the hospital room until nurses realized what he was waiting for. Every night, at exactly 9:12, the old cat appeared at the end of the hallway on the third floor of Maplewood General Hospital. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. The fluorescent lights hummed their hollow, indifferent song above the linoleum floor, and the night staff went about their routines, charting vitals, adjusting IV lines, whispering in low voices near the nursing station. But at 9:12, without fail, something in the air shifted. A door would swing open at the far stairwell exit, and a gray and white cat, old, deliberate, unhurried, would walk calmly down the corridor as if it had every right to be there. It did not meow. It did not run. It moved with the quiet certainty of something that had made this journey before and had no intention of explaining itself to anyone. The cat turned left at the junction of hallways, passed the supply closet, ignored the open door of room 3-10 where an elderly woman slept with the television still glowing, and stopped at room 312. It pushed through the slightly ajar door with one gray paw, crossed the dim room in 4 measured steps, and jumped slowly, carefully, with the aching deliberateness of old joints, onto the hospital bed. It settled itself against the left side of the patient lying there, a man who had not opened his eyes in weeks, and it stayed, perfectly still, perfectly present. No one could explain how it got into the building. The hospital had automatic doors at the main entrance and a staffed security desk. The stairwells required keycard access after 8 in the evening, and yet the cat arrived every night, as if the walls themselves had simply agreed to let it pass. The patient in room 312 was a man whose chart listed his name as Harold Mercer, 79 years old. Admitted 6 weeks prior following a severe stroke. His condition was described clinically as unresponsive, though the nurses who cared for him preferred not to say that word aloud. He lay beneath a thin hospital blanket, his breathing shallow but steady, his face slack and pale, his hands resting open at his sides like a man who had finally released everything he had been holding. No one had come to visit him, not once in 6 weeks, and at 9:12 every night, the cat came to sit beside him. The nursing staff noticed within the first few days. At first, the reaction was practical and firm. Night security escorted the cat back outside twice, then 3 times. One of the maintenance workers, a quiet man named Dennis, tried setting a cardboard barrier across the hallway near the stairwell exit, theorizing that was how it got in. The barrier was found flat on the floor the next morning. The cat had returned that same night, at 9:12, to its place on the left side of Harold Mercer's hospital bed. No one could deny that the animal had a routine. It was not wandering. It was not exploring the building or scavenging for food near the cafeteria. It made no detours. It greeted no one. It walked its fixed path, entered the fixed room, and remained beside the fixed man for most of the night before disappearing sometime in the early hours before the morning shift arrived. It was as though it had drawn an invisible map of one single destination and erased everything else from its world. The orderlies began talking about it during handoffs. One of the older nurses, a practical woman named Carol, who had worked the night shift for 17 years, said she had seen stranger things and that someone ought to just call animal control in the morning and be done with it. But when morning came, the cat was already gone, and somehow no one ever made the call. Days passed, then a full week. Then, too, the cat continued to arrive. The cat continued to leave. Harold Mercer continued to breathe in his slow, undisturbed way, and the space beside him on the left side of the bed held the faint warmth of a small body that had been there for hours. It was on the 14th night that one of the younger nurses began paying close attention. Her name was Emma Calloway. She was 26 years old, 2 years out of nursing school, and had been assigned to the night shift on the 3rd floor for the past 4 months. She was not particularly given to sentimentality on the job. Nursing had taught her quickly that emotion needed to be managed, held at a careful distance from the clinical work of the hands. But Emma was observant in the way that good nurses always are, attuned to small details that others dismissed, and the cat had begun to occupy a corner of her thinking that she could not easily ignore. She had watched it arrive. She had watched it walk its path. She had noticed that it never once paused at any other doorway, never turned its head toward the sound of a television or the smell of cafeteria food being wheeled past on a cart. She had crouched in the hallway one night and held out her hand, thinking it might sniff her fingers or rub against her. It had looked at her a long, level look from pale amber eyes, and then continued walking toward room 312 without breaking stride. It did not behave like a stray. Strays were skittish, easily startled, always half alert to danger. This cat moved through the hospital with the ease of an animal that had never needed to be afraid of anything. Its coat was clean and well kept, a little thin at the flanks but not matted, not dirty. It was not starving. Whoever had once cared for it had cared for it well, and those habits of trust and stillness had not left it. Emma noticed something else. The cat never approached Harold from the right side, always the left, always the same position, curled against his ribs just below his left arm, the tip of its tail resting lightly against his wrist. She told herself this meant nothing. She told herself she was inventing significance where there was only animal behavior, pattern, and repetition that had no deeper story. But she stood in the doorway of room 312 on a Tuesday night and watched the cat settle against the sleeping man, and she felt something she could not name, pulling steadily at the back of her chest. On the 17th night, something changed. Emma was making her rounds just after 11 when she paused outside room 312 and looked in through the observation window in the door. The cat was in its usual position. Harold lay still, his chest rising and falling in its slow, mechanical rhythm. And then faintly, almost imperceptibly, Harold's left hand moved. His fingers, which had been open and inert for weeks, curled slightly, not toward the blanket, toward the cat. Emma watched, perfectly still, her hand flat against the cold door. The cat did not startle. It pressed its side more firmly against Harold's ribs, as though it had felt the movement and responded to it. She told herself it was an involuntary reflex. Neurological misfires happened in unresponsive patients. She wrote it in the notes as an upper limb tremor, documented it properly, and went back to her station. But she sat at the nursing desk for a long time afterward, and she did not feel certain about anything she had written. The next morning, before her shift ended, Emma sat down with Harold Mercer's file. The medical record was thin in the ways that mattered most. Harold was listed as a widower. His wife, a woman named Dorothy, had died 11 years prior. There were no emergency contacts on file, that line had been left blank. And someone had noted in pencil beside it, "None known." His admitting physician had documented that he had been found unconscious in his apartment by a neighbor who had not seen him in 2 days. The neighbor had not stayed. There was no record of family, no record of visitors. No one had asked after him. Emma found his address in the admitting paperwork. 42 Birchwood Lane, Apartment 7, in the older residential part of town, about 1.5 miles from the hospital. She stared at it for a long moment, then closed the file and drove home to sleep. But the address stayed in her mind all day, and when she woke in the early afternoon before her shift, she found herself in her car, without being entirely sure when she had decided to go. 42 Birchwood Lane was a 2-story brick building with a narrow front walk and a row of overgrown juniper bushes along the foundation. Several of the mailboxes in the lobby still showed handwritten names on paper cards tucked behind plastic windows. Harold's card was still in place. H. Mercer, Apartment 7. She stood in the lobby for a moment, then knocked on the door of Apartment 6. The woman who answered was in her mid-60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a dish towel over one shoulder. Her name was Beverly Hartley, and she had lived next door to Harold Mercer for 8 years. Emma explained who she was and why she had come, and Beverly's expression shifted immediately into something soft and sad. She leaned against the doorframe and looked down the hall toward Harold's door, which stood quiet and still, as though it had been holding its breath. "Yes," Beverly said. Harold had a cat. Of course he had a cat, a gray and white Tom named Jasper. "Old," she said, "maybe 14 or 15 years old." Harold had found him as a kitten under a dumpster behind the grocery store on Clement Street, half drowned in a paper bag, and had carried him home in his coat pocket. That was back when Harold's wife was still alive. Dorothy had said they absolutely could not keep a stray, and then Dorothy had been the one feeding the cat from a silver spoon at the kitchen table within 2 weeks. After Dorothy died, Beverly said, Jasper was all Harold had. He was not a man who talked about his feelings. He was not a man who asked for help or let people in. But Jasper was with him every evening. Every single evening, Beverly said. Harold would sit in his armchair after dinner, and Jasper would climb up beside him, and they would sit like that together until Harold went to bed. Every night, without exception, when Harold was taken to the hospital, Jasper had disappeared from the apartment. Beverly had noticed because she sometimes heard him meowing through the wall in the evenings. The meowing had stopped the night Harold was admitted, and she had not seen the cat since. Emma sat in her car outside the building for a long time after that conversation. She thought about the way the cat always arrived at 9:12. She thought about Beverly saying every evening, after dinner. She thought about the left side of the bed, and Dorothy, and a gray Tom found in a paper bag behind a grocery store, carried home in a coat pocket by a man who was not the kind of man who talked about his feelings. She drove back to the hospital and sat with what she knew. Everything fit. The cat was not a stray. The cat was not drawn to the room by warmth, or the smell of medication, or any of the clinical explanations that had been offered in the break room over the previous 3 weeks. The cat had found Harold in a building it had never entered before, in a room it had no logical way of locating, on a specific floor behind specific doors. It had found him the way you find someone you have always known the shape of, even in the dark. Jasper had been doing at the hospital exactly what he had always done at home. He had come every evening and settled on Harold's left side, because that was the place he had always settled. He had arrived after dinner, or what had once been after dinner, because that was when Harold sat down and the evening began, and the two of them entered their quiet, wordless compact of simply being present together. He had not stopped coming, because Harold had not stopped being there. Harold was still in the room. Harold was still breathing, and Jasper, with the absolute and unsentimental fidelity of an animal that does not understand abandonment, had simply continued to show up. He was not waiting for a miracle. He was not hoping for anything specific. He was keeping a promise that had never been spoken, because some promises are too deep for words, and are made entirely in the language of habit and presence, and the particular warmth of one body beside another in the dark. Emma went to the head nurse that evening and told her everything. The shift supervisor, a woman named Patricia Danvers, who had spent 23 years in hospital administration and had seen more than enough to trust her instincts, listened without interrupting. When Emma finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Let him stay." There was a brief conversation with the hospital's administration the following morning, during which words like liability and protocol were used. But Patricia had a way of making clear when she considered a conversation to already be over, and this was one of those conversations. By the end of the day, a small notation had been added to Harold Mercer's care file. It read, simply, "Patient's companion animal approved for overnight visits, room 312. A food dish appeared near the window. A folded blanket was placed at the foot of the bed. Dennis, the maintenance worker, who had once tried to block the cat's entry with a cardboard barrier, began propping the stairwell door open just slightly before 9 in the evening and closing it quietly just after. The nurses who worked the overnight shift in the weeks that followed would later describe something in room 312 that they struggled to explain in clinical terms. The room had a different quality than the others. It was not quieter, exactly, because all the rooms were quiet. It was not warmer. It was something more like the feeling of a space that was fully occupied, not by machines or procedure, but by something that had decided it belonged there and was not going to be moved. Jasper arrived each night. He walked his path. He jumped carefully onto the bed and settled against Harold's left side. He stayed. Emma began stopping at the doorway on her rounds, just for a moment, the way you stop at the edge of something that is beautiful and heavy in equal measure. Harold Mercer's condition did not improve in the way that medical terms define improvement. His neurological function showed no significant recovery. His responses remained minimal, but on 3 separate occasions over the following 2 weeks, nurses charting his vitals in the late evening documented the same small observation. When the cat was present, Harold's left hand would come to rest lightly along Jasper's side, not reaching, not grasping, simply resting in the unhurried way of a man who has done this 10,000 times before. Then came the night of the 22nd of the month, at 11:47 in the evening, when Emma was at the nursing station filling in a medication log, and one of the other nurses appeared in the doorway of room 312 and called her name in a low, careful voice. Emma walked in. Harold Mercer's eyes were open, not wide, not startled. They were open in the slow way of a man waking from a very long sleep, blinking once, twice, the lids heavy but the gaze present. His eyes moved slowly, with effort, as though searching a dark room by touch, and then they found Jasper. The cat had not moved. He was exactly where he always was, pressed against Harold's left side, his amber eyes fixed on the old man's face with a steadiness that had not wavered in weeks. Harold looked at him for a long time. His lips moved almost imperceptibly. No sound came out, or perhaps the sound was too small for anyone else to hear. But his left hand lifted just slightly, just barely, a trembling and enormous effort, and came to rest on Jasper's back. Jasper lowered his head. He pressed his chin to Harold's wrist. Emma stood at the foot of the bed and did not move, and did not speak. And she would remember later that she had pressed her knuckles against her mouth so that she would not make a sound. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then Harold's eyes closed again, slowly, and his hand stilled, and his breathing returned to its shallow, even rhythm, and he was somewhere else again, somewhere that had no windows or doors, no fluorescent lights, no particular hour. But he had been there, for 4 minutes in the middle of the night, with no family and no witness but a young nurse and an old cat. Harold Mercer had been completely and undeniably present. He died 9 days later, on a Thursday morning, just before dawn. His breathing had become labored in the final hours, and the overnight nurse had stayed close, checking his oxygen levels, adjusting his pillow. Jasper had been there all night, in his place, pressed against the left side of the man who had carried him home in a coat pocket 15 years ago from behind a grocery store on Clement Street. The end, when it came, was quiet. Harold's chest rose once more, and then did not rise again, and the monitor beside the bed registered the change with a soft, continuous tone, and the nurse reached over and pressed the silence button. There was nothing sudden or violent about it. It was simply the completion of something. Jasper did not move for a long time after. He lay still beside Harold, the way he had always lain still beside him, and the room held its quality of full presence for just a little longer. Then, sometime before the morning shift arrived, he stood. He stretched carefully, the way old cats do when they are working out the stiffness from their joints. He stepped to the foot of the bed and sat upright and looked at the room for a moment, the machines, the quiet, the thin gray light beginning at the window. Then he jumped down and walked out the door and did not come back. Emma heard about it when she arrived for her shift that evening. She stood in the hallway outside room 312, which had already been cleaned and remade, the sheets fresh and tight, the monitors dark and silent, the folded blanket at the foot of the bed removed. The room was simply a room again, its number on the door as ordinary as any other number, holding no particular history. She thought about what Beverly had said. Every evening, without exception, she thought about 912, and the stairwell door propped slightly open, and the left side of the bed, and a hand lifted with enormous difficulty to rest on the back of an animal who had not stopped believing that the person he belonged to was worth coming back for. There is a particular kind of loyalty that does not require recognition. It does not need to be witnessed or rewarded or even understood. It simply persists through closed doors and locked stairwells and weeks of silence, and the long, indifferent machinery of a building full of strangers, because it has made a commitment that exists below the level of language, in the part of living things that knows, without needing to be told, that presence is not nothing. Presence, given freely and consistently, and without expectation, is perhaps the most complete form of love there is. Jasper had not saved Harold Mercer. He had not altered the course of what was happening in that room. He had not healed or fixed or reversed anything. He had simply refused to leave someone alone who had been left alone by everyone else. He had shown up every night at 9:12 and settled on the left side of the bed and stayed, because that was what he had always done, because that was the only thing he knew how to do, and because in his old, uncomplicated understanding of the world, the person who had carried him home in a coat pocket was still the person he was supposed to be beside. That was enough. That was, perhaps, Everything. The food dish near the window was gone by the next morning. The folded blanket was gone. The cardboard barrier that Dennis had once propped against the stairwell, long since discarded, was not replaced. The door to room 312 was assigned to a new patient by noon, and the floor returned to its ordinary rhythms. The hum of machines, the soft exchange of handoffs, the careful choreography of people doing difficult work in the middle of the night, while the rest of the world slept. But something remained. Not visibly, not in any way that could be charted or documented or discussed in a morning briefing. Just a residue of something that had been fully itself in that room for weeks. A faithfulness so uncomplicated it did not know it was remarkable. A waiting that had no name for itself. A love that had traveled however far it needed, to travel to be in the right place, at the right time, for as long as it was needed. Emma Calloway would work 7 more years on the night shift at Maplewood General. She would care for many patients in many rooms, some of them surrounded by family, some of them alone. She would hold hands when hands needed to be held. She would sit in doorways in the middle of the night when there was nothing clinical left to do. She would learn, slowly and without ceremony, that the distance between presence and absence is the most significant distance there is, and that crossing it, simply showing up, is not a small thing. She never forgot room 312. She never forgot the cat who walked his fixed path through a building full of people who did not know his name, to a room where one man lay still and alone, and who lay down beside him every night, without asking what it meant, without needing it to mean anything, because he was not there for meaning. He was there because Harold was there, and when Harold was gone, there was nothing left to stay for. The bed in room 312 was empty. The night was ordinary, and somewhere in the dark streets of the town, an old gray and white cat with pale amber eyes and aching joints walked slowly in a direction no one saw him choose. He did not look back. He had already given everything.